In Herodotus, however, we find a huge variety of speech. I mean, some of these speeches are very long, some are very short. We have poetry, we have letters, we have speaking dreams, we have messages, we have speeches in speeches, we have formal orations, we have informal conversations. In some, there is an enormous amount of material. Just take, for instance, the one-word direct discourse speeches. For instance, Hegesistratus, the Samian, mentioning his name to Leotychides in Book 9, and compare that to the very extensive speech of Sophocles in Book 5, 592, with all the narratives in it. And you get a bit of an idea of the enormous, the wide array, the wide variation of speeches as they are found in the histories. Now, one of my arguments is that our understanding of Herodotus' speeches has been impeded somewhat by the tendency to define and consider and research speeches in ancient literature primarily as formal public orations, orationes, or as the Germans tend to say, Reden. And then focus on its rhetorical features and on its public performance. And in fact, this kind of criticism goes back to the ancient literary critics like Dionysius from Halicarnassus and Quintilian, who already made a distinction between this, arguing that Thucydides was the one who wrote Contiones or Demegoriae, public orations, whilst Herodotus wrote Prosopopoiae or Sermones, in generally conversational character speeches, private speeches, distinction that was made in the works of the literary critics of later antiquity. Now, this distinction was picked up in the early 20th century by Felix Jacobi, who pointed out in his famous article in the Real Encyclopedia that there are, in fact, public orations in Herodotus' histories and also some private speeches that nonetheless bear the hallmarks of formal orations. And he gives as an example the debate on the future Persian constitution, which is held in an informal setting of 7 conspirators. But the speeches are nonetheless very elaborately argued and built. So what Jacobi then said, he distinguished between political historical speeches and novelistic speeches, and argued that the latter were derived from a short kind of lively told story that was typically told in Ionia in the 5th century BCE, a genre that he called the Ionian novella. So this gives a bit of an idea of Jacobi's refinement of the classification of the ancient literary critics. Now, the problem is this distinction, I mean, has been very influential in discussions on Herodotus' speeches. I just list a few publications at the bottom that generally make use of this distinction in focusing on Herodotus' speeches. For instance, the very useful and helpful work by Haney in 1976, I'm sorry, is only about the informal conversations, and he clearly struggles with a definition where to stop then discussing speeches. But you can see that this distinction remains a bit of a problem. The problem lies first in the fact that this whole idea that there was something like an Ionian novella as a genre cannot be proven. There's not a single trace being found of those kind of stories. I mean, basically what we see here is the postulation of a genre on the basis of what we see in Herodotus' narrative. And that genre would then be the sort of origin, the sort of model that Herodotus would have looked at when he composed his own stories. So it's a bit strange. It seems that sort of certain characteristics that you see in the famous stories, the canonical stories in Herodotus, such as Gyges Candoles and the youth of Cyrus, are ascribed to something that he has learned somewhere else, he's picked up somewhere else in Ionia. So incidentally, this whole idea also denies the option that it may just have been Herodotus himself who developed his own way of storytelling. And the second problem here is that what Jacobi did was adding the term historical to political. So more or less implying that the formal orations that he qualifies as such not only bear the hallmarks of an oration in a public setting, but can also be seen to be more historical. And this is, of course, problematic, as we lack any evidence. In the entire corpus of Herodotus, there are actually only 2 instances that you could call speeches in a way, if you want. I mean, there's actually 2 inscriptions, which he quotes, of which the existence is independently confirmed. But for all other utterances by his characters, including all the oracles, independent evidence is lacking. Some of the speeches recur in later authors, like Diodorus Siculus, like Plutarch, but their reliance on other sources that did not depend on Herodotus cannot be proven. So what I've written about this is the following, just to take this matter of how historical are these speeches to heart. Said Herodotus wrote about events that took place at least 2 generations before his time, and the records of which were mainly transmitted orally. And we know that, of course, through the work by Rosalind Thomas. And thereby these records and eventually the speeches that might have been part of them were subject to variation, change, embellishment, wear and tear, owing to geographical dispersion, the intervention of time, as well as changes in political and literary preferences. And we learned this, of course, from Finlay already in his article in the Use and Abuse of History, and the dangers of trying to reconstruct a story on the basis of its oral tradition. Additionally, we cannot reconstruct to what extent Herodotus himself, as a historian of non-contemporary events, followed his sources and whether those sources themselves had preserved an accurate version of the speeches that he attributes to his characters. So we can therefore neither exclude nor confirm that there are any historical speeches preserved in the histories, as they were delivered by historical individuals at a certain time and place in the past. So to my mind, it's inconclusive, and it's also a discussion that is, not really something I want to get into. And that is because you can also look at this from another perspective, which is the more theoretical perspective of what an author is doing when an author is quoting someone of something. If you look at it from the narratological angle, and then I refer to the beautiful pieces written by Sternberg and Fludanik on this topic in the 80s and 90s, you get to the point that you say, well, what is certain is that Herodotus, as the narrator of the histories, bears ultimate responsibility for the words spoken by others as they appear in his work. Even if these words derive from historical statements, as Sternberg argues, their formal integration in a narrative composed and focalized by a historiographical narrator, the repurposing and recontextualizing of their content within that narrative and their shifting configuration in relation to their addressee fundamentally transform their meaning. Once embedded in the narrative, a character's words no longer reach their original historical addressees, but instead are directed towards an addressee shaped by the narrator within his text. And furthermore, the entire narrative itself is received by an external readership, which, depending on time, place, and cultural context, may interpret its characters' speeches in different ways. So to paraphrase Fludanik, the originality of any speech in a narrative, even when rendered in direct discourse, is an illusion. So basically, having concluded that the division that Jacobi made of Herodotus' speeches in basically historical and literary ones, or historical and ahistorical ones, turns out to be untenable, this made me decide to study Herodotus' speeches from a different point of view. Not as passages representing some kind of historical speech, but as utterances attributed by the narrator to someone else in the text. So basically my definition became any other voice that Herodotus presents in his work, on the assumption that he, as a narrator, bears ultimate responsibility for that voice. So that brings me to my second point, the overall purpose then of the result, the study. Defining speech in this particular way yielded a quite massive database of all instances of verbs of speaking, reporting, demanding, ordering, backing, etc. that you find in the histories. So how to make that into something that is workable, coherent, that took quite some time. On the advice of Christopher Pelling at the time, I chose to adopt a model for speech representation in narrative that was developed by Andrew Laird in his 1999 publication, Powers of Expression, Expression of Power, Speech Presentation and Latin Literature. Andrew Laird, quite insightfully, developed a descriptive model for speech presentation in narrative, in which he distinguished grammatically between direct discourse, indirect discourse, and what he calls a record of a speech act. Short statements in the narrative, such as like he begged for mercy, or he asked for his weapons, or he spoke angrily, that are often somewhat overlooked because of this sort of grammatical dichotomy also in our grammar books of distinguishing between direct and indirect discourse, oratio recta and oratio obliqua. In fact, it turns out that Herodotus uses an enormous amount of these records of speech acts, and that allows him to convey his information in a much more economical manner than some of his predecessors could. If you compare his narrative to that of for instance, the choral lyricists or the epic, I mean, you can quite well see that he uses these short RSAs, as I called them, to present his narrative in a much more economical way, especially when he wants to repeat information that he has already told at more length elsewhere. Complication, however, from using this model by Laird was that it also forced me to include all cases of indirect discourse that Herodotus attributes to his informants. You can think about the lengthy passages in his Egypt book, book 2, where he presents the information as reported to him about the early pharaohs by the priests, with whom he at least presents himself as being in conversation. So in order to solve that problem, because we have two different types of indirect discourse in a way, I propose to distinguish in terms of speech representation on the one hand between so-called character speeches, so ascribed by the narrator to a character who delivers them to an addressee within the text. And on the other hand, I distinguished so-called informant speeches, which basically contain historical, geographical, ethnographical information that Herodotus then grammatically attributes to another voice than his own and presents as such in his text. And the way in which that happens is in Herodotus either by way of indirect discourse, as we know, or by way of an adjunct clause with hos, in which case you just have to see what he's actually doing and where the information that he shares with us is actually attributed to his source or his informant, and where his own voice comes in. In the end, this yielded a database of 2,848 speeches. And well, that sort of is a mind-boggling polyphony, basically. So the first thing I did was exclude all the speeches that referred backward and forward to speeches within Herodotus' works. Instances like he repeated what Croesus had asked him, and all these shorter RSA-like speeches. And that brought some alleviation, but not much. I mean, I brought down the number to 1,637 character speeches, and then 377 informant speeches. So my database still consisted of more than 2,000 instances of speech in Herodotus. So that would have kept me busy for a life. I think if I decided to write on every single instance, which I decided not to do, of course, I decided to be more selective at that stage. I decided to start reflecting on their overall purpose. Why would Herodotus do this? Why this enormous wide array of speeches? Why this ear-deafening polyphony? And in what ways would it help him in bringing across his message to his audience and his future readership that he also aimed for? This is where historiographical authority comes in, a concept I owed to John Marincola's book, as well as to Rosalind Thomas' study, Herodotus in Context. The principle that ancient historiographers seek to persuade their audiences and readership of the truth of their version of history. From that principle arises the notion that Herodotus would not have chosen to make his work so polyphonous if it had not helped him somehow in enlarging his authority as a historian. In other words, while those who adopted the novelistic versus political historical dichotomy carved up Herodotus' texts in passages that were supposedly ahistorical novels, mainly there for the purpose of entertainment, and passages which had immediate historical relevance, I take the view that every single speech act, whether spoken by a character or an informant, must ultimately somehow be meant to contribute to his authority as a historiographer. For the simple reason that without that authority, he would not have been able to make a living as a writer, as a historiographer, and a researcher in the ancient world. So the first part of my book is to argue for this relationship between Herodotus giving someone else in his text a voice and his own authority as a writer, as a historiographer. That could be quite relatively straightforwardly done in the case of his informants. In my book, I follow views that have earlier already been developed and expressed by Tom, who's here, by Chris Pelling, by Irene de Jong, and also others, views that counter the sort of standard view that was held for a long time on Herodotus' source references and informants. That it is felt that he introduces them in his work when he is in doubt or skeptical about the information he presents. Now, I quote here from Shrimpton's book on history and memory in the ancient Greek world. I argue instead that these passages are all somehow meant to help Herodotus in enlarging his status as a proper historian for his audience. In other words, they do not only reflect on the status of the information that he presents, but also, and perhaps more importantly, on his own historiographical persona, as these passages are meant to reflect his meticulous research and the full accounts that he wishes to give of the events, also when, for instance, his sources are at odds. Thus, we find many of these so-called informant speeches in his ethnographic passages, when he conveys what he was told by the peoples whose lands he visited and made known to his Greek audience. And as an example, under number A, I quote a very small passage from the first book on Delphi, where the Delphians claim that the silver bowl was crafted by Theodorus the Samian, and I agree. Objects, customs, sort of typical information you find in his descriptive passages, where there's absolutely no reason to think this is a matter of doubt or skepticism. It is just Herodotus telling his readers, look, I did my homework, and in this case, I agree with what the others told me. Other instances are found in the case of historical claims. You see that, for instance, quite often in the Egypt book, where he uses the narrative of his own research to a certain extent to bolster his authority as a historian. However, the example I give here is taken from book 6, where you find an otherwise unspecified informant speech. There is no individual attached to this, or no group or people to whom he ascribes this speech, but an unspecified informant speech to support his assertion that a great number of ships and crew were destroyed at Mount Athos, which is incidentally, of course, a key event in explaining why this Persian campaign faltered. The numbers of casualties are not derived from Herodotus' own observation, but they are presented as based on a report that is told, legatai. And by omitting specific informants here, Herodotus seems to imply that this information is more widely shared. He is thereby subtly lending credibility to the extraordinary scale of the disaster. Furthermore, we can think about the many variant versions that he inserts, which illuminate his desire to be as complete as possible. And these references to his informants are there to show his audience that he went to great lengths to assemble his information, even in the case of distant lands that he could not visit himself, or distant pasts that can only be known through oral traditions. So unless he explicitly assesses or contrasts their credibility, his stance towards these accounts remains impartial, and he allows his narratives to evaluate them independently, and thereby draws in his readership, draws in his narratives. And I illustrate this with a quotation from Book 3, where Herodotus reports two different traditions about the death of the Samian tyrant Polycrates, and leaves it to its readers to believe whichever they prefer. So when it comes then to the larger bunch, the character speeches, their role in helping Herodotus in establishing historiographical authority at first glance appears to be more difficult to prove. However, there is one passage in the Egypt book that highlights their role more than anywhere else. And this concerns a passage where Herodotus is very polemic, defending the alternative version of the Helen myth, arguing that that version, the version that she did not join Alexander to Troy, but stayed in Egypt, is the historically correct version. Interestingly, these chapters are part of a series of episodes on the early Egyptian pharaohs, which Herodotus by and large attributes in the longest informant speech in his work to the Egyptian priests. And I give an overview here on the slide. However, when Herodotus arrives at Proteus, the king who actually will keep Helen with him, he suddenly drops this informant speech. The priests are not going away. They return later on, but suddenly he starts narrating in his own voice, for the first time in the Egypt book, also attributing speeches to his characters in direct discourse, and even staging a minor character in the person of Thonis, who makes Proteus aware of the arrival of the Trojans on his shores. Now, given that Herodotus is really keen to prove that it would not make much sense for Helen to be at Troy during all those years of war, it is striking to see that he resorts here to primary unembedded narrative and pays attention to characterization by way of speech. After Proteus, because after Proteus, he returns to indirect discourse again and narrates the story of his successor Rhampsinitus in the longest uninterrupted sample of indirect speech in the histories of almost 1,000 words. So what I conclude from this passage is that Herodotus seems here to use scenic, slow-paced, ornated narrative with speeches, with details, with characterization to enlarge his authority on a subject he chooses to engage, because this is something he wished his readership, he wanted to impute on his readers. This was something he was very convinced of, as also appears from the argumentation that Helen could not have been in Troy throughout all those years without the Trojans handing her over to Menelaus in 219 and 20. I think it is instructive to take this passage into consideration when evaluating other stories in Herodotus that show such traits. The stories that have often been described as novelistic, such as the Gyges and Candolis story, Croesus on the pyre, the story of Cyrus' youth, Cyrus and Tomaris, Cambyses and Praxaspes, and of course Xerxes and the dream. In fact, what Herodotus seems to do in these passages of slow-paced and scenic narration is seeking engagement with its audience, and thereby steer its attention to the human interaction within the courts of Oriental monarchs that will give rise to great historical events. Think about the end of the Myrmenid dynasty in Lydia, or the end of the kingship of the Medes when Cyrus takes over. As Prispelling argues in his Herodotus and the Question Why, Herodotus embodies the spirit of his age in his focus on origins, on etiology, and the historian therefore carefully analyzes the communication within these Oriental courts at Sardis and Susa, because he believes that it is there that the most important cause of the Greco-Persian wars can be found. Developments within those courts actually matter. And it is therefore no wonder that he has so many more private speeches than public speeches, in contrast to, for instance, Thucydides. For Herodotus, the setting of many important speeches is the Oriental court. For Thucydides, it is the assembly. And Herodotus thereby traces the origins of great conflict back to private interactions between individuals within these courts. And these speeches he likes to record, in particular in direct speech. And it is nice to illustrate this with some statistics then, which shows actually that the most frequently speaking individuals within the histories are not Greeks, but the 4 Achaemenid kings along with King Croesus. This shows that the histories is, at least in part, most of all, a history that focuses on Achaemenid Persia. The Oriental courts are at the heart of his narrative. It is there that the events take place that seal the fate of 10,000s, that lead to the destruction of cities, and to glory and honor for victors. And this is the message that Herodotus, by engaging narration with speeches, seeks to bring across to his audience. So, having explained the overall purpose of the book, the overall argument, the link between speech, narrative, and authority, I now come to the third part of my presentation, in which I aim to share with you some more specific conclusions that I could draw, amongst others from the statistics that I assembled. First of all, I think we should revise our understanding of Herodotus' relationship with the Homeric narrative. Ever since Strasburger's Homer und die Geschichtsschreibung, it has become almost commonplace to define Herodotus' narrative, the speeches in Herodotus' narrative, as very much indebted to Homer. However, studying Herodotus' speeches often makes clear how different they are, and also how innovative, compared with those found in Homer and archaic poetry. First, Homer does not use speeches to refer to informants or sources. There is simply no need to, as he can rely on the muses for the information that he shares with his audience. But there are other salient differences too. Homer has much more direct discourse in his work than Herodotus does. While the statistics teach us that Herodotus' favorite mode of speech presentation is actually indirect discourse. Half of the speeches of his characters are presented in indirect discourse, as opposed to Homer, whose great majority of speeches is presented in direct discourse. Furthermore, Herodotus has the tendency of using really brief speeches, less than 10 words long, in direct discourse, something that is, at least in a percentual aspect in Homer's narrative, much rarer. Altogether, what we can see is how Herodotus anticipates a tendency that we also see in later Hellenistic and Roman historiography, in which the majority of the communication between characters is expressed in indirect discourse, and speeches in direct discourse are relatively scarce, mainly underlining events that are crucial, of great importance. Think, for instance, about Cassius Dio's debate between Octavian, Agrippa, and Maecenas on the future Roman constitution after the Battle of Actium. Another important difference with Homer is Herodotus' ample use of speeches that are delivered across distance. 21%, that's 1/5 of all character speeches in the histories, are delivered across distance. either presented as an instruction speech to a messenger or as a delivery speech when read out to their addressees. Again, Herodotus' focus here is on the East. First, because the large empires there require a completely different manner of coping with distance between urban centers and courts compared with the average Greek states, where you could simply walk or ride on a horse or a mule to the town and there accost an official, archon, or ephor on the agora. So Herodotus deliberately showing how different it is to live in a huge empire such as the one conquered by the Persians. But Herodotus is also keen to stress the vertical distance within these Oriental courts, thereby illustrating their hierarchy, but also the really isolated position of their kings, who are dependent on their advisors and their wives. In fact, Herodotus at one point in his work very much contrasts the success of open debating within a state with the quite problematic lines of communication within the royal courts of, in this case, Xerxes, when he narrates about the debate in the Athenian assembly on the oracle of Delphi that predicts the city's downfall, and shows that Themistocles' decisive interpretation of the last verses of the oracle given to the Athenians results from an open sharing of opinions among many speakers. And this then can be contrasted with the many debates in Book 7 and 8 in which the great king is involved. For instance, when Xerxes sends his second in command, Mardonius, as a simple errand boy to the admirals of his navy on the eve of the Battle of Salamis, without being present himself at their meeting. And there are very many more examples of communication being impeded and in a way frustrated or simply made impossible by the strict vertical hierarchical structures at the Persian court, at least that is within Herodotus' description and perception as he wishes to convey it to his readers in his histories. And in fact, if you then look more closely at the many Persians in particular, but also others who fall victim to the campaigns that the Persian kings undertake, you can make the point that Herodotus is about the first who really understood the danger of objectification or so-called mechanical dehumanization in empires with a large vertical hierarchical distance. Telling illustrations of this are, for instance, Croesus' accepted advice to Cyrus to sacrifice a weak part of his army so as to lure the Massagetæ to drink from Persian wine. Another example is Darius and Zopyrus plotting to make the Babylonians trust the latter by sacrificing in total 7,000 of the Persian soldiers. I mean, from a Greek perspective, this would amount to losing the entire hoplite population of a middle-sized Greek state. I mean, this must certainly have horrified, in a way, the Greeks who heard this. Given that the well-trained male body was for the Greek states their main resource in defending their states, the carelessness that Herodotus attributes to the Persian kings in dealing with their armies, I mean, it must have astonished the Greeks. In fact, it's interesting when I read this summer the Scourati's books on Mussolini. I found a quote that somewhat resembles what happens in the history in the fourth book of this tetralogy that just came out on Mussolini during World War II, where research is based on quotes that are known. And one of these quotes actually shows Mussolini willing to sacrifice a couple of thousand men of the Italians in battle to prove his allegiance to Hitler and thereby gain a better position in eventual negotiations. I mean, this is what tyrants do, gambling with the lives of thousands, whilst being too far removed from them in this vertical hierarchy from a man to really value their individual lives. So far about speech and distance. Important theme in the histories. A third point, a third conclusion I could draw from the database is the role of advice in the histories. When we think about advice in the histories, we tend to think that its content is generally sensible or wise, and that the addressee of the advice, usually an Eastern monarch, will ignore it. And this is indeed the case in some canonical scenes in the histories. For instance, Solon's advice to Croesus, and of course Artabanus' advice to Xerxes when he announces the war against the Greeks. Both pieces of advice are initially ignored and even ridiculed. In fact, however, if we look at all the pieces of advice as they are found in the narrative of the histories, so all cases where someone recommends something to someone else, and that someone else has the liberty either to follow up or ignore it, actually in the majority of the cases, the advice is heeded or accepted or followed up. And in quite a few cases, the advice itself then turns out to be detrimental or even downright disastrous for the addressee. Think, for instance, about Cyrus, who follows up Croesus' advice to cross the Araxes and fight the Mesagetai in their own territory. Or think about Mardonios' repeated advice to Xerxes to invade Greece. Advice is more often followed than ignored, and not all advice is equally wise. So Herodotus' focus, rather than on sort of misalignment between a wise advisor and a tyrant who is not willing to listen, Herodotus' focus rather seems to lie on advice giving in general. And an interesting passage that shows how that works is in Book 1, when Herodotus describes how Elaetes sends messengers to Delphi to inquire about a chronic illness, either because he was recommended to do so, or because he decided to do so himself. So when presenting a ruler, Herodotus seems quite keen to stress that they can be advised to do something, that they are not operating in isolation, but that the ultimate decision remains with them, as in Elaetes' case, who ultimately decides himself whether or not to consult Delphi on his illness. Now, in my book, I argue that the advisor theme again allows him to focus on communication within the hierarchy of Oriental courts. The majority of speeches in the histories, as I show in Table 18, are exchanged between characters in different unequal hierarchical positions. And that brings along, of course, all sorts of problems in communication, as we know well from, for instance, Chris Pelling's work on the language of the advisors in Herodotus. A fourth point of interest relates to Herodotus' awareness of contemporary developments in rhetoric. In The Art of Persuasion in Greece, George Kennedy identifies 4 signs of rhetorical consciousness in Herodotus. An awareness of formal speech structures, an interest in etymology and wordplay, the use of sophistic stylistic devices such as antithesis, and a subtle approach to argumentation. Various passages that I discuss in my book demonstrate that Herodotus was not only conscious of rhetoric, but also capable of abstract reflection on it. And while Thomas Herodotus in Context highlights this aspect by a focus on Herodotus' argumentative passages, I have explored it through his speeches. Herodotus, for instance, is acutely aware of what Aristagoras should and should not have said to Cleomenes in order to persuade him to support the Ionians against the Persians. And elsewhere, in introducing his speeches, Herodotus comments on the appropriateness of the arguments used by his speakers. For instance, when he introduces Themistocles' speech at Salamis and describes to his narratees that it is actually a different argumentation that Themistocles chooses to maintain in his public speech from the one that was offered to him by his advisor Mnesiphilus, mainly for the purpose of not offending his audience. Characters like Darius, Mardonios, and Themistocles employ dubious sophistic reasoning, as well as its familiar stylistic features, to win over their addressees. And Themistocles, even there's this speech, Themistocles' speech to the troops at Salamis, his Parainesis, is even summarized as an abstract, a speech abstract, with Herodotus focusing more on the language, the form of the speech, than on its content. I'm quoting here the passage from chapter 83 of book 8. So what you see is a nascent theoretical discourse about speech, about language, and about literature. And it's also found actually in Herodotus' decision, this discussion of Homer's decision to make Helen remain in Troy, which we discussed before, immediately following the Proteus narrative passage. And I refer to Bruno Curry's piece on that in Histories, where he has analyzed the literary, the language of literature, the language of literary criticism that Herodotus employs in that passage. So Herodotus clearly capable of abstract reflection on what his characters aim to achieve with their words, and shaping their speeches accordingly in his historiographical narrative. So just as in his tendency to favor indirect discourse and shorter turns of speech, also this abstract reflection on contemporary rhetorical tendencies puts him firmly in the second half of the 5th century, much closer to Thucydides than to Homer or the choral lyricists. And we may occasionally smile about some of Herodotus' observations and arguments, but let this then not be an archaic smile. Finally, the speeches also draw attention to the very complex role of the gods in human affairs as described in the Histories. Herodotus' narrative reveals how individuals are harshly and sometimes disproportionately harsh, punished not only for their actions, but also for the thoughts that underlie them and the words they choose to express them. We can think about Croesus, whose mere idea of himself being the most prosperous man in the world made him incur the indignation of the gods and lose his son. Or of Glaucus the Spartan, whose family became extinct because he thought he could ask the oracle of Delphi whether he was allowed to steal money entrusted to him by a Milesian friend. In the same way, we can argue that Xerxes is punished for expressing the thought of making his empire match with that of Zeus when conquering Europe. When he wants to withdraw his plan, the gods intervene and send a dream to him that tells him to move ahead. It is clear that Xerxes is meant to suffer the consequences of his decision. What has to happen, the Greek says. In contrast to Agamemnon's dream in the Iliad, Xerxes' dream is not deceitful. It is dead serious, without Xerxes realizing that it sends him on a path of destruction rather than glory, which results in the death of hundreds of thousands of his troops. Nevertheless, humanity's capacity to learn from these past experiences remains limited, as Herodotus demonstrates, also through the speeches with paradigmatic narrative, such as the one held by Sophocles and the one held by Leotychides. When it comes to the gods, Herodotus harbors no illusions, and it requires real cleverness to escape from them once they have placed an individual on a destructive course. Xerxes has to learn it the hard way, but there are some minor characters in the histories, such as Aristodicus from Kyme and the Ethiopian king Sabacus, who realize in time what the gods are doing to them and manage to escape this path of destruction. However, most other characters in the histories are too flawed to take a step back. And that brings me to my last point, which relates to Herodotus' pessimism on human character. Because within the histories, no characters seamlessly combine remarkable deeds with equally impressive speeches. Words of wisdom are spoken by advisors, but they often lack clout, while lies, flattery, and manipulation play a decisive role in causing great historical events, such as Xerxes' invasion of Greece, to happen. I argue that in the last chapter of my book. The military achievements of the Spartans stand in stark contrast to the few words that Herodotus attributes to them, and that's statistically proven. It's actually interesting. Vasily Kizali already demonstrated how few words the Spartans are attributed by Herodotus. And you can actually prove that statistically too. While the rhetorical flourishes of Ionians like Histories and Aristagoras failed to disguise their meager efforts in their rebellion against Persia. Herodotus assigns his three longest speeches to Sophocles in Book 5, to Artabanus in Book 7, and to Leotychides in Book 6. Yet none of these leaves a lasting impact through their actions. Sophocles does not appear again in the histories beyond his speech, and Artabanus fails to dissuade Xerxes from a dangerous military campaign. Leotychides is not able to convince the Athenians to release the Aeginetan hostages with his paradigmatic narrative on Glaucus. So the individuals who come closest to embodying the ideal of excelling in speech and action are Darius and Themistocles, as their military successes are partly rooted in their ability to persuade others. However, their actions are also driven by self-interest, and Herodotus characterizes them as greedy and self-centered. The absence of individuals comparable to Achilles or Hector or Pericles in the histories suggests that Herodotus did not intend his work to be to commemorate heroes. Instead, the histories serves as a monument to humanity in all its shortcomings, without exception. Time and again, people fall prey to greed, exploit their positions of power for personal gain. And the worst excesses described by Herodotus occur in autocracies, where hierarchical power structures obstruct the free exchange of information, and rulers, unchecked by constitutional constraints, make decisions immediate and far-reaching consequences. But Herodotus' own time may have also taught him that no political system, not even democracy, was immune to greed, manipulation, and violence. And in this respect, the limited persuasive success of the speeches within the paradigmatic narratives delivered by Solon, Sophocles, and Leotychides seems to suggest that Herodotus was not optimistic about the impact of his own histories as a paradigmatic narrative, despite his evident pride in his monumental achievement. And this seems to signal realism, but also a profound pessimism of a man who witnesses violent events occurring all over again, basically saying that human beings are prone to forget the lessons from the past. So, in conclusion, let me just give you end with a brief description of the book as a whole. I had limited time, so decided in this lecture to focus on a handful conclusions that I could support with statistical analysis, mainly from the first 4 chapters. However, the book also has chapters on several episodes within the histories, with a lot of speeches, such as Darius' accession to the Persian throne, which includes a discussion of the constitution debate, Croesus' downfall as king and his subsequent dubious role as advisor to Cyrus, the role of speeches in the Ionian revolt, and the prolonged scene at the Persian court when Xerxes presents his decision to invade Greece. So the overview of the TOC is here on the slide. I'd suggest by all means contact me when you want to know or read more. I happily share an electronic copy of the book with you. So for now, thank you very much for your attention. We're back at the Champagne in Amsterdam.